The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Marc Morial, president of the National Urban League, with a call to action to create a more equitable and inclusive nation. Mark Schmitt on the rebuilding of the left in American politics, plus Bill Press with Dana Milbank on the GOP attempt to rewrite the history of January 6th. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. An annual report released by the National Urban League concludes that we're living in a historic moment that demands that historic injustices are recognized and repaired. For National Urban League President and CEO Marc Morial, that means that as America seeks to move beyond COVID-19, it cannot return to what passed for normal before the pandemic struck. And we say hello to Marc Morial, an American political and civic leader and the current president of the National Urban League. Mr. Morial served as mayor of New Orleans from 1994 to 2002 as the city's youngest mayor. He also served as president of the United States Conference of Mayors in 2001 and as a Louisiana state senator from 1992 to 1994. Mayor Marc Morial, thank you for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure to have you with us. Now, we want to start this interview talking about the recently released State of Black America. First, how long has the National Urban League been issuing the report, and how does it come together each year?
Well, look, thank you for the attention on one of America's most important annual reports, the State of Black America. It began in 1976 as the vision and idea of the legendary Vernon Jordan, who served as the fifth CEO of the National Urban League. Jordan envisioned the report as focusing on the challenges that urban communities, racial justice, issues of equity, which he felt had not been addressed in the then President Ford's State of the Union. It comes together as a project where we, if you will, curate scholars, elected officials, business leaders, labor leaders, and activists to comment on an annual topic. And then each and every other year, we release a statistical index, which compares the social and economic status of Black Americans with those of whites and Latinos in this nation. So it's an important report, and we just released our 2021 report about a month ago.
Right, and this year's report has a very compelling title, The New Normal, Diverse, Equitable, and Inclusive. What is it about the current normal in America today that calls for something new?
We cannot look at 2021 without an examination of 2020. And 2020 was the year of pandemics. The pandemic of COVID, the pandemic of racial justice, the pandemic of the economic coma that resulted as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So coming out of this, 2020, and our report talked about this, it exposed these wide racial disparities in healthcare, the disproportionate deaths and infections that African Americans and Latinos suffered, the disproportionate impact on jobs and the economy. And in the year of George Floyd, his vicious and untimely and unnecessary, heinous murder on the streets of Minneapolis spurred, if you will, a moment of new awareness and awakening in America. As we look at that, we should all recognize that in 2021 and beyond, it is not about returning to what was before. It is about building a new normal, a new frontier, a new approach in this nation, which is more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to schools and education, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to institutional and structural exclusion and racism. So this year's report is a call to action for each and every American, for Black Americans, of course, but for all Americans for whom racial justice and a more equitable, inclusive America is what they want.
And you've called the report a call to action on three key fronts: the economy, healthcare, and public safety. So let's start with health. What has been the impact of the pandemic on the health of Black America, and how do we begin to repair the damage?
You know, it's been devastating when you look at the fact that life expectancy for Black Americans declined by almost 3 years last year. When you compound that with the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic caused more severe infections and more death amongst Black Americans. And when you look at the healthcare system's inability to effectively respond because there are not enough doctors serving Black and brown communities. There are not enough hospitals that are convenient to Black and brown communities. And there are also a disproportionate number of African Americans who neither have Medicaid, Medicare, nor private insurance. That combination, and those without insurance are situated mainly in the South, in states that have not adopted the expansion of Medicaid. So public policy has impacted the severe devastation that COVID has carried out on all Americans, but particularly and especially Black Americans. So those healthcare disparities have been there. They were exposed and exacerbated by COVID.
Okay, now let's turn to public safety. The new normal you describe is one where, quote, police approach the communities they serve as allies and collaborators and not hostile combatants, close quote. Do you see any signs of hope that this could actually happen?
Look, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to policing. The law enforcement is on track in 2021 to shoot 1,000 people. Imagine that, 1,000 people killed by law enforcement. Some may say, well, are a large number of those killings justified? I would admit that there are probably some which are, but there's no accountability built into the system. The George Floyd case in Minneapolis, where Derek Chauvin was convicted, stands to some extent as an exception to the general rule because of a wide range of circumstances. The independent prosecutor, Keith Ellison, the availability of videotapes because of the young woman who taped the incident, a very, very assertive and aggressive movement across the nation of protests to raise awareness. But we have so much work to do. Police departments, which engage in what I call just crackdown policing, are usually ineffective in stopping violence, or, if you will, creating a community that is safe. And we have a challenge in America because police-community relations in many cities are not what they ought to be. And when we have a challenge of both in many communities where the community may feel unsafe, but then they also do not have high trust for the police. So it's a difficult arrangement in many cities. And I'll always concede that there are some chiefs and mayors and cities that are working very hard to run counter to this narrative with true community policing and true neighborhood policing. We have a lot of work to do in this area. That's why the National Urban League has published its 21 pillars to re-envision public safety, available at our website at nul.org, as a guide for what communities and activists and police chiefs and mayors county council members, city council members can use to advance meaningful policy changes when it comes to policing, law enforcement, and public safety. This is a call to action. And at the national level, we need the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Not that it is a panacea, not that it is a magic wand, not that it is a silver bullet, but that it is a tool to be used to hold police officers accountable and to push and prod, incentivize, and require systemic changes on a proactive basis by some 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country.
All right. And finally, the economy. America's failing on economic justice on so many fronts, and it's hard to fight too many battles at the same time. So what are the frontline issues that should define this vision right now?
Let's talk about some quick solutions. Raising the minimum wage, and the effort to raise the minimum wage has been spotty. You've had states who've taken those steps. You've had some companies who've taken those steps. But we need a comprehensive national minimum wage law. That's been the way in which the minimum wage has been handled for the most part since the 1930s. But regrettably, in the last 15 years, Congress, not a single Congress has seen fit to really respect the hardworking men and women of America by creating a minimum wage which is just, which is compassionate, and which rewards work. We have to reward work in a way that gives people the dollars that they need to be able to live a dignified life. And that is what it is about. It is not simply about profitability of companies. It is also about the quality of life of American workers, and those workers then become consumers. So I think that we have to focus on a range of things when it comes to the economy. I do not mean to suggest that fixing the minimum wage problem is going to fix the deep systemic issues we face when it comes to the economy. But I think it's a step. It's something that can be done. It's something that is within the power of Congress, and it will lift up many boats. The child tax credit enacted by the Congress, the earned income tax credit enacted by the Congress are also public policy supports to assist men and women and families who are at the lower end of the economic scale to live a more dignified life and to be able to pay for the necessities for themselves and their children and their loved ones. That's what this is about. It's about families. It's about children. It's about men. It's about women. It's about people who are struggling and working. It has become more difficult and more challenging to be able to make ends meet in this environment today, 2021, than it was in 2001 or than it was in 1991. The rising cost of housing, the stagnation of wages. And these are issues that within President Biden's infrastructure plan, American Families Plan, a number of steps I think would be foundational to begin to address these systemic challenges. More must be done. More is absolutely needed. But this is what we need to do. We can do things now. The American people, by broad margins, support an increase in the minimum wage to more of a living wage at $15 per hour.
And let's turn now to the political context in which these calls to action are taking place. You've been critical of looking at the fight for racial equity in America as a zero-sum game. What does that mean, and where do you see that taking place?
Zero-sum game is fundamentally this notion that if Black people and brown people get ahead, it comes at the expense of white America. And I categorically reject that mindset, that mentality, and those who promote it and fuel it. We build, we can grow, we can make this nation more equitable in a way that moves the needle forward and that involves large gains for all communities. And that is one of the things. It's a mindset. Zero-sum game is a mindset. If you automatically believe that, then you'll act accordingly. You'll try to block others. You'll try to thwart others. You'll try to stop others. I think that an enlightened point of view recognizes that we as a nation are becoming more diverse, more multicultural, more multiracial. And that reality is a reality we have to build a nation. And that means Black people, brown people, all people. There are many, many white Americans suffering in poverty in this country, and many white Americans struggling to make ends meet. It is not a Black or brown thing alone. It's disproportionate when Black and brown people have the twin sword or the twin blade of having to also deal with bias, whether explicit or implicit, in their daily lives. But I believe that this fight for racial justice is an important fight. It's important work in the economy, in schools, in healthcare and education, to recognize that laws and customs and practices and policies have fueled this economic and racial divide. And therefore, these laws, customs, and policies now have to be weapons and have to be allies and have to be tools that are used to advance the cause of a more level playing field for all Americans.
Well, how do we fight that thinking? I mean, should racial justice advocates spend their time trying to convince those who believe in the zero-sum game that they're wrong?
I think we have to convince people by educating people, by helping them understand history, by giving them an opportunity to share their stories, but also by educating public policymakers and lawmakers and legislators, but also bringing positive pressure on them to do the right thing. And I think there's a role for the private sector, whether the private sector is higher ed or private corporations or nonprofits, all of these institutions. And so it is not just about convincing. It's about encouraging, but it's also about pressure, and it's about creating this better understanding. But at the end of the day, it's not an understanding for the sake of an understanding. It's an understanding that leads to action. I talked about the minimum wage. I could talk extensively about how we rebuild a more equitable healthcare system. We need more African-American doctors, more African-American nurses, and we need more health clinics in neighborhoods. We need an expansion of healthcare in those states where people still do not have Medicaid or any other form of insurance. We need affordability of medicine. There are many of these measures that would benefit Black and brown communities, but they would also benefit many, many white Americans. And that's really the point, right? When you think about these issues, they're issues of racial justice, but they're also issues of economic poverty. They're issues of people being left out and locked out of the economic mainstream in this country. And we all have to recognize that this generation, we have to build a new normal. The generation after World War II understood that they wanted to build a new normal. The civil rights generation, my parents were part of that generation. They recognized in the 1970s and 80s they had to build a new normal. And they worked hard to build a normal which was better than the normal that they grew up in. We have to do the same thing. Some complacency or belief that all we need to do is go back to the way where things were, we don't accept that. And that's what the state of Black America is all about.
And lastly, you've described the years of 2020 and 2021 as years of pivot. What makes you hopeful a pivot is possible, and what do Democratic politicians need to be doing to force the turn in the right direction?
Democratic politicians need to pay attention to this assault on democracy and need to send a message that by any peaceful means necessary, we will protect against this pandemic of an assault on people's right to vote that is beginning to take place in states across the nation. More than any other thing, it is important that there be an understanding that the future of this nation hangs in the balance. My great fear is that we're drifting into a system of American apartheid. What does that mean? Where, because of the rules around voting, combined with the Electoral College, and tools like the filibuster, a minority of Americans can effect control all branches of government. Through voter suppression and gerrymandering, you control the Congress and the legislatures. Through the Electoral College, you install presidents who don't win a majority of the popular vote, but somehow surgically put together enough votes in the Electoral College. And then in the legislative body, you use tools like the filibuster, which empowers a small group of people to be obstructionists on legislation that has broad support amongst the American people. And when you combine those tools, you thwart, if you will, this growing new majority in this nation, which is multicultural, that where young people and emerging generations have a voice. And I'm greatly concerned that it's important to look at all these. So Democratic politicians who represent, more than anything, broad multiracial coalitions have to recognize that you cannot allow this effort to suppress the vote, to make it more difficult for people to vote for no reason whatsoever, based on false narratives, based on fake news, based on bogus rationale. And by doing so, you limit, you make it harder, and you destroy confidence in democracy.
All right. Marc Morial, American political and civic leader and current president of the National Urban League, former mayor of New Orleans, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Mayor Morial, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And you as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, what we get wrong about the recent history of the right and the left, and why we need to set the story straight. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
At a recent congressional hearing on America's so-called labor shortage, mega banker Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase offered this insight. People actually have a lot of money, and they don't particularly feel like going back to work. Jamie, most people are living paycheck to paycheck. And since COVID-19 hit, millions have lost their jobs, savings, and even homes. So they're not exactly lollygagging around the house counting their cash. Instead of listening to the uber-rich class ignorance of Dimon, who pocketed $35 million in pay last year, Congress ought to be listening to actual workers explain why they're not rushing back to the jobs being offered by restaurant chains and such. They would point out that there's no labor shortage, there's a wage shortage. More fundamentally, there's a fairness shortage. It was not lost on restaurant workers, for example, that while millions of them were jobless last year, their corporate CEOs were grabbing millions, buying yachts, and living large. Yet, more than half of laid-off restaurant workers couldn't even get unemployment benefits because their wages had been too low to qualify. Then there's the high risk of COVID exposure for restaurant employees, an appalling level of sexual harassment in their workplace, and demeaning treatment from abusive bosses and customers. No surprise, then, that more than half of employees said in a recent survey that they're not going back to those jobs. After all, even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. To get the workers they need, corporate giants should try the free enterprise solution right at their fingertips. Raise pay, improve conditions, and show respect. Create a place where people want to work. This is Jim Hightower saying, for a straightforward view from workers themselves, go to the advocacy group onefairwage.site. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Marc Schmitt is an expert on progressive political reform. In this moment of new possibility, he calls on progressive Democrats to recognize the years of successful organizing that got us here. And we say hello to Marc Schmitt, political scientist and director of the Political Reform Program at New America. From 2008 to 2011, he was the executive editor of The American Prospect, where he was a columnist beginning in 2005. He's also the author of a recent piece in Democracy Journal titled The American Left is a Historical Success Story. Marc Schmitt, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, and the pleasure is ours. Now, you know, it's not very often you hear the left and success in the same sentence, but in this piece, you are describing this moment as possibly transformative in its way as that first year of Reagan was. What are you seeing that says success?
Well, I think you're seeing a whole bunch of new ideas entering the agenda. And it's not just that they're all being passed as legislation. We're not quite sure about that. Some of them have. But for example, the new thinking about antitrust enforcement that is permeated the Biden administration. There's reforms, the idea of very generous subsidies that would continue even after the COVID crisis in terms of the child tax allowance and things like that. You're seeing a lot of changes at the state level, things like millionaire surcharges, cannabis legalization, a real shift in the sense of what's possible, obviously not in every state, and a grinded out battle at the federal level, but a pretty significant change from the Obama administration or the Clinton administration in terms of what's possible at the federal level, and really quite dramatic changes in a lot of states, and more in the kind of spirit of what's possible. You don't hear people worrying about the federal budget deficit all the time. Whereas, a few years ago in the Obama era, I was just looking at a poll, it was like the second biggest issue that was worrying people. So it's that overall change in attitudes, much stronger organizing capacity, and change at both the federal and state level.
And what you do in this piece is tell the story of how we got here, and it's told alongside a history of the rise of the right. And you write that we have always had a fascination with that history. Why is that the case, and at what expense?
Well, I think a lot of us are fascinated by the history of the right because it's been a part of our lifetimes. I was just started college when Reagan was elected, and at that point, a lot of the assumptions of what's called the era of liberal consensus were kind of blown up in an instance, and we've been dealing with that ever since. I was, 14 years later, Newt Gingrich comes to power in the House, bringing another different style of conservatism. But there's also like an intellectual story behind that that's really, really interesting. How the agenda was created for Reagan by the Heritage Foundation, the characters preceding that from the 50s, 60s, 70s, who really built out the conservative infrastructure, how they managed to do it, how they both organized and used ideas together, from the defeat of Goldwater in 1964 that seemed like this is the end for American conservatism in electoral terms, to just 16 years later coming back with Reagan, Republican Senate, conservative House, and a very, very different set of possibilities. And there are intriguing characters along the way, and there are fascinating organizations and funders, and there's eccentricities, and there's real basic stories about how you create a winning coalition.
Mm-hmm. Now, you write that even with so much focus on the history of the right, there's still a lot we get wrong. What are some of the more common misconceptions?
Well, I think the big, most common misconception is to imagine it as this tightly organized vehicle with particular funders, with a particular plan. A lot of people, for example, focus on the Powell memo, which is a note that Lewis Powell, who was later to be a Supreme Court justice, wrote to a neighbor who worked at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, saying, the Chamber of Commerce should do this and this and this in the area of education and media and so forth. And people just say, okay, there was the master plan. The master plan got written and then it was executed. Well, that's kind of a total misconception, because it was really not executed in anything like the way that Powell suggested, and certainly not by the Chamber of Commerce. Although he did have a lot of insight about the challenges that not just the right, but in his terms, just the business community, the corporate community faced. There's a friend of mine, the political scientist named Steve Tellis, wrote a book called The Conservative Legal Movement. And in that, he calls it the myth of diabolical competence, like that we on the left tend to see people on the right as like magically competent and really well organized and having a tight plan that we don't have. And I think that's a misconception, because all these kinds of changes are always messy. They didn't have such a tight plan, and we're not doing so badly.
And of course, we have to ask the same question about the left. As you look at how we got here, what are some of the myths you see emerging, and what is more anchored in reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest myth about the left is really that it's always too disorganized to get anything together, that it's always a story of conflict, that it's always fails to achieve its goals because it's not aggressive or ambitious enough in the way that the right is, that it's not well organized enough, that there isn't enough capacity, that we're outspent by the right, most of which isn't really true.
What's your sense that progressives may be willing to let go of the sense of being less organized than the right? And what do we gain if we do?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's sort of better to be realistic about where you are than operate from an illusion, right? So it's just, it makes sense to be accurate. I think there are moments where we should sort of pause and celebrate a little bit. I think there's a tendency on the left to move so quickly to the next thing that we forget to kind of celebrate what our successes have been. It's always never quite enough, and there are going to be bills that we can't get passed, and there are going to be things where, we want Biden to support, for example, full student loan forgiveness, and he doesn't want to do that. That's a loss. It would be better to not have that loss, but let's not. It'd be healthy to kind of pause and celebrate our accomplishments. And I think feeling like you can succeed, like, nothing breeds success like winning. And that's a big part of the Republican story after their momentum picked up, really a little bit before the Reagan era. But as they began to go forward, they kind of operated with a little more confidence that, in fact, people are on their side. And I think the left right now, the center left broadly defined, has something like a real majority in this country and a real workable majority in a lot of states that's cut off, that's limited by some of the structures like the Electoral College, but it's real and we should own it. And we should act like people have a majority, because we do.
Yes, amen to that. Marc Schmitt, political scientist and director of the Political Reform Program at New America, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Marc, thank you so much for your time with us. We'd love to do it again soon.
Sure, it was a real pleasure to have this conversation.
Well, thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with Dana Milbank on what should come next for the Capitol Hill insurrectionists and the January 6th Select Committee.
Sarah Palin is going to run again. Maybe, at least. Just think about it. Doesn't that make your day?
Oh, it's Old Timers Day. I love it. She's like it's like Babe Ruth getting back in the game. But you know what? She was Trump before there was Trump. She pioneered this, the whole version of the Republican Party we are seeing today. Mm-hmm. It's just really a pivotal moment. In fact, I'm doing a book going back to 1994, and she's one of those absolute key figures, along with Newt, along with Karl Rove, along with McConnell, and of course the more recent cast of characters.
Right. No, absolutely. What I wonder is, she's been living in Arizona, I think, like for at least 10 years. Do you think anybody in Alaska remembers her, knows who she is?
I think everybody in America who was alive in true. 2008 to, say 2011 cannot forget her. But the real question is, so she's had the sort of Trump base before, Trump had that base. So I think I wouldn't want to handicap it, but I think she would probably have a pretty natural following. The real question, I suppose, is Alaska, Lisa Murkowski's Alaska, or is it, Trump's Alaska? So that could be like a proxy war.
Well, I certainly hope she runs, because it'll give us you and me and a lot of others a lot of material to cover. Right?
I used to feel that way, Bill. But I'd love the material, but now I feel like it's all right. You know what? I got enough material. I'd like a little less. I'd like to have days when things are normal, when there's nobody's acting like a white supremacist, nobody's being violent, nobody's upending the rule of law. I would just, I yearn for like a really boring appropriations subcommittee hearing.
Well, you're not getting that today so much from Republicans in the House. I was particularly struck by a recent column of yours just the other day when you covered a news conference that was held the same day, the first hearing of the Select Committee on January 6th, the same day. There were 6 Republicans who held a news conference in front of the Department of Justice. Your column had the headline, "As hearings begin, Republicans side with the terrorists." Who was there? What was their message, Dana?
Yeah, and I think it's time we call a spade, and we've wrestled with what to call the insurrectionist on January 6th, and I noticed that I think it was Hodges, one of the police officers, was calling them terrorists. I think that's right. I mean, some were calling them domestic terrorists. A terrorist is a terrorist. They were there to disrupt our democratic way of life. But so these were the usual sort of wingnut characters. You had Maggie, Marjorie Taylor Greene, you had Gates, you had Gozar, Biggs, Gomert. I think there was another slightly less crazy one there, maybe Good. So they had it in mind that they would have that particular day to demand justice, not for our constitutional system, but for those who are being jailed awaiting trial for their role in the insurrection. Now, of course, as Americans, we believe everybody has their constitutional rights and due process, but it definitely, they were calling them political prisoners as opposed to actually violent criminals who broke into the Capitol with the intent of killing lawmakers. But they were ambushed by an older fellow with a whistle under his face mask, and one guy with a whistle at a pretty small news conference can make a heck of a lot of noise. And I was amused by the scene, but I was also a bit annoyed because I couldn't hear them to get their quotes. So the guy with the whistle was not thinking of my needs. And then there were a few other hecklers shouting about Matt Gaetz being a pedophile, and there was somebody in a giant Trump costume saying pedophiles for Trump. So it was quite a scene. They had come, ostensibly to get an audience with Merrick Garland, but for some reason the Attorney General decided not to have a meeting with this motley crew. I think he probably said, "Why don't you schedule an appointment?"
But it certainly was a colorful scene, but at the same time, it's pretty disturbing, right? When any member of Congress, right, is basically siding with the terrorists, if we want to call them that, or the mobsters, whatever, as against law enforcement. I mean, what happened to the Republican Party as a party of law and order?
Right. And, what was disturbing, I think, was not just, you never know what the nutters are going to do. But, that same day you had Kevin McCarthy and his leadership team, they had a news conference. They weren't blaming the insurrectionists for January 6th. They're blaming Nancy Pelosi. I guess because she appointed somebody to the Capitol Police Board. She appointed exactly the same number of people to the Capitol Police Board as Mitch McConnell did, but somehow he was not to blame for the insurrection. And they were basically blaming the cops and blaming Pelosi, and just by omission, letting off the actual violent people who attack the Capitol and with the aim of killing Pelosi and Mike Pence. So it's not just the people on the fringes. You're always going to have people in any party on the fringes saying crazy things. The problem is they seem to be. There's quite a bit of overlap with the mainstream of the party and the party leadership. And what I'm hearing is a lot more sympathy for the people who attack the Capitol than their victims and their target.
And in fact, as Maureen Dowd reminded us in her column on Sunday, there were 21 Republicans who voted against giving a gold medal to the Capitol police officers who protected them on January 6th.
Yeah, there's lots of questions to be raised about who actually stands with the police. There would been a lot written. I've written about in all of these iterations of COVID, the Democrats have been trying to send more money to the states for the police. Republicans have been opposing that. Now, is that defunding the police? Well, it's certainly not funding the police. And then you look at the cops program, year after year, Republicans actually have been trying to defund the police. So, I think the Democratic claim on that is very much a strong one. Who's siding with the cops and trying to get military weapons off the streets of America? It's certainly not the Republicans. So I don't think the Democrats should be playing defense on that issue at all. I think they should be on the offense.
Right. It's hard to understand, but is there any basis at all that one could say, any reasonable argument you could make to side with the mobsters, the armed mob that attacked the Capitol? This was nothing short of an attempt to undermine democracy and overthrow the U.S. government.
Oh, right? Come on, Bill. It was a normal tourist visit.
Yeah. Oh, a normal tourist visit, right.
Look, I think there's nothing, I think we all should say that the accused, anybody accused of anything in America gets due process and has their constitutional rights and should be treated fairly like everybody else. I don't. Nobody disagrees with that. There
Right.
were some complaints that these people were being not being being treated unfairly or being held in solitary confinement. And you had Elizabeth Warren and Dick Durbin, to their credit, speaking up and saying, "Hey, let's make sure they're being treated fairly like everybody else." So, by all means, they should have their constitutional rights. But it's just such a curious placing of emphasis, not on the victims of this, who were the members of Congress, the police, and our democratic way of life. So, there's no question that the sympathies seem to be lying in the wrong place here. And setting aside the issue of, yes, of course, everybody accused in America deserves the protection of law.
Right. And that particular group, at any rate, the six you mentioned, and then a couple of others, are clearly standing with the insurrectionists and not with the Capitol Police who defended them. Another column recently, Dana, Speaker Pelosi, perhaps certainly in a moment of frustration, said about Kevin McCarthy when he challenged the mask rule in the House of Representatives, saying it was just a political move on her part to have more political control. She retorted, "He's such a moron." Your column, entitled "Fact Check: Is Kevin McCarthy a moron?" Well, what's the answer?
Well, I'd like my readers, your listeners, to make their own judgments. So I just decided to list a whole bunch of things that he has said. He clearly has done, serious battle over the years with the English language. He's come out the loser on most of those battles. And to be fair, I checked with his staff. I said, is this guy, if he has some sort of a speech disability, we shouldn't be making fun of the guy. There's nothing wrong with that. But they did not make such a claim. So that sort of eliminates a more benign possibility. So I use the lingo of the truth teller to say mostly true. But, of course, everybody's entitled to their own judgment on this. I do think people should, maybe diagram one of his speeches. And it's not just like I didn't pick out speeches where he made errors. I just picked out, I just looked at all the speeches he made that week. And you could do the same thing in any week. And, I wrote that, Rachel Maddow a few years ago called it a word typhoon, but it's really more of a tornado because they just sort of, the words get just like distributed at random and phrases at random. And some words just disappear. You can't find them anywhere. But it definitely has that tornado effect. Like, suddenly the kitchen sink is in the bedroom. And that's what seems to be going on between his brain and his mouth.
It does make you sometimes, when he completes a sentence, scratch your head and say, "What? What did he say? What does that mean?"
I'm not sure if I agree or disagree because I have no idea what he just said.
But the other thing, he bounces around. Look, he's certainly an all-out Trumper. At the same time, at one time he said the president is clearly responsible for what happened on January 6th. And like a week later, he said, there's no evidence that the president instigated this at all.
Yes. And then last week he was saying that, in fact, it was Nancy Pelosi. Upon further review, he's gone to the videotape.
Do you think that Nancy Pelosi outplayed him on this January 6th commission?
Yeah, it's been an interesting duel there. They're in the position now of saying, first of all, Nancy Pelosi is responsible for the insurrection, right. And then they were saying, we want a fair and bipartisan investigation. Now, how do you say that after you've defeated the bipartisan, completely independent commission that was negotiated by the ranking Republican on the Homeland Security Committee in the House?
At Kevin McCarthy's
at his request, yes.
Yes.
So, I think basically in this case, his initial instinct was correct. He saw what Trump had done, and then he quickly realized that his instinct for what was right was colliding with his political survival instinct, which is to stay at the top of this party, not leading the party. He's basically following, and that means that he cannot have any distance between him and Trump. So, we had the kissing of the ring at Mar-a-Lago, and it's been all Trump fealty ever since. So, look, I think he's very weak. He's not in charge of that caucus. Jim Jordan is running the House caucus essentially. Jim Jordan, who he would have placed on this committee to blow it up. I did have, I wondered if Pelosi was making the right move and booting Jordan and who was the other one, Banks off the committee. Right. But you just listen to these guys, and clearly they were just going to stop it from doing anything. So look. It would have been better to have an independent commission. That was an option. So, we're going to get some answers. And the best thing the committee can do, less than reaching its own conclusion, is just have the officers out there like they were last week doing that. And, we got to hear the story over and over again. We've got to make sure that the, side of democracy, wins the narrative as opposed to, the insurrectionists winning the narrative.
How do you assess the role of Liz Cheney in all of this?
I don't know, Bill. I've been wondering if I had Dick Cheney wrong all along.
Don't go that far.
Maybe he was a force for good in the world. Well, he must have done something right with his daughter, or maybe it was Lynn. But this is she's very brave. If she's making a political calculation, it's such a long shot that she's making. But I think it's heroic. I think it's was it Margaret Chase Smith who stood up to McCarthy? I think it's in that vein. Kinzinger, he has a lower profile, but they've risked their political career, but also just sort of personal approbation and all kinds of abuse to say, hey, this is what's right. It has nothing to do with political party. It has nothing to do with ideology. I believe in our constitutional democracy. And why this is controversial is at this moment is why we're in such a mess.
Bill Press with Dana Milbank. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Marc Morial, Mark Schmitt, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.